Oh, howdy all, grab yourself a drink. It is time for some PathOfExile 1 discussion. Today, I wanted to take a look at the Atlas meta that's developed in patch 3.26. We're going to be looking at Atlas setups that are popular on very high level characters across the trade league for Mercenaries. Now, it's worth noting that this is going to reflect one moment in time. This is going to be a couple of days before I recorded this video. It's going to be looking at the way that people's Atlases were set up at that moment. Atlases are a lot more fluid than characters because when you change from one character build to another, you got to do a whole lot of things to make that happen. You've got to change gear, you got to change your passive tree, you might need to do another lab in order to change ascendancy. A whole lot of things you got to mess around with. You also need to level up gems. It's not something you can do instantly. With the Atlas though, it's something that you can keep 3 Atlas layouts that you can hot swap between, and on top of that, you can also swap Atlases just for currency. It just costs orbs of unmaking, and they're pretty cheap in this league. So with that in mind, it's worth remembering that this is something that players can swap out of very quickly, and so next week it might be quite different to what you see at the moment. A quick note on methodology. This video is a bit of an experiment. I haven't done one of these Atlas meta roundups before. We're going to try things out, and the way we're going to do it is by looking at high level characters that don't opt out of their characters being public. These characters, their Atlas details, and a whole bunch of other things get scraped by the website POE.ninja through Grinding Gear Games' API. Now this video is going to cut off at level 98, so I'm only looking at people who are level 98, 99, and 100. If you look at people who are a bit lower than that, you'll find a lot of people haven't finished their Atlas yet. They might be sitting on 100 points, 105 points, 110 points. They've still got things to unlock. And whilst there are plenty of people, myself included, that do not have a level 98 character in the league, but do have the Atlas fully done, that is a little bit unusual. So I wanted to focus on people that are that bit further ahead in progression. This is quite late in the league, so pretty much everyone that wants a level 98 character has one. In fact, people who want level 100 characters, they pretty much have them as well. It just comes down to whether you play recklessly or not. Also, because this is a new type of video, something I haven't done before, I don't really have much feedback on what works and what doesn't. So if you think that I go on for too long about various front matter at the start of this video before getting into the specifics of the various strategies, let me know that down below. Alternately, if you think that I assume too much knowledge and therefore I should expand on some of that front matter, also let me know that down below as well. Obviously, I can't please everyone, but I can try and take into account what are common bits of feedback and then try and use that the next time I do this, assuming that I do this video again for a future league. Something that's very important to remember as well. Atlases and Scarabs, these things go hand in hand. They influence each other, and you only have 5 Scarab slots. Obviously, you only start with 3, but you'll unlock your 4th and your 5th reasonably quickly, certainly before the time you hit level 98. So this means you've got enough Scarab slots for one mechanic to do it properly, or maybe occasionally to do 2. Now, sometimes there's interplay where you can take a bit from column A and a bit from column B, and we'll get to some of the things people have done with those as well. And what I want to encourage people to do is think about your Atlas and your Scarabs holistically. Think about them as one cohesive whole, rather than as being something where you decide your Atlas first, then you decide what Scarabs go with it. It's also good to have one of your 3 Atlases be one that is just your I cannot be bothered trading for Scarabs today setup, because that means that you've got a lot more flexibility. If you just want to log on, goof off, and not play very seriously, well, you can do that. You can ignore all juicing, and you can just go with things that you've got huge amounts of, or you can just not even use Scarabs at all. Now, a quick note on character builds. I'm not going to focus much on the pairing of character builds with Atlas passive trees, even though in the real world this is a very important decision. The reason for this is that there's a couple of limitations with getting good data on this. That's because someone might have an Occultist and a Volcanic Fissure of Snaking character that they both play, and the last time they logged in was on the Occultist, and they did a bunch of Scarab generation with them, and they use a Scarab generation tree. But that Berserker that is Volcanic Fissure of Snaking, they're still going to show up as being associated with that Scarab generation tree, even if they're just not interested in running them at all. So the API can't really associate your characters with the Atlases you like to run with them. It can only associate the fact that you've got this character on your account with the way that your Atlas is set up. Not much pairing of builds, except where I'm really confident as to exactly how people are using them together. And as always, there's a little bit that needs to be said about particular items. The Cartography Scarab of Risk was buffed to the moon and beyond in 3.26. Using one of these is literally the equivalent of using 2 of them back in 3.25, and they were actually good in 3.25 as well. So they had their power literally doubled. This is also not a super rare Scarab, and as a result, it's something that's become extremely commonly used. However, Using it requires pretty specific Atlas setups, and also these reward certain playstyles. Because, for instance, Cartography Scarab of Risk, it can add Physical Reflect to a map that doesn't have it. So these can brick entire maps for certain builds. On top of this, there are certain mechanics that just don't scale their loot very much with Cartography Scarab of Risk, and a couple of examples of this, you have in-map heist events. Smuggler's Caches, they don't really give much more loot when there's additional map modifiers on the zone, when there's additional zone quantity, when there's additional zone rarity. Destructive Play is similar. Destructive Play doesn't really care whether you've got additional quantity, additional rarity. Cartography Scarab of Risk doesn't play well with these mechanics, and that's something important to keep in mind. The best thing, though, to stack with Cartography Scarab of Risk is actually more Cartography Scarabs of Risk. There's also the inner quantity wheel and the inner quantity and rarity hybrid wheel. These are also quite good with it. Now, it's worth noting that Cartography Scarab of Risk stacks quite counterintuitively with Map Modifier Effect. So new modifiers from Cartography Scarab of Risk, they're not scaled, but this is still fine. There is still escalating returns for having more modifiers. So to go through the numbers of how this works, imagine that you've got a tier 16 map. It's got 50% modifier effect on it, and it's got 8 mods on it. So that's kind of like you've got 12 mods on this map. There's 8 mods, but each of them is 1.5 times its normal effect. One Cartography Scarab of Risk takes it from 12 up to 14, 5 of them take it from 12 up to 22. And that's because they give you 2 unscaled modifiers each. Now, on average, modifiers add about 5% pack size and about 14% quantity, and I think it's about an 11% rarity on that as well. So it means that the 5th Cartography Scarab of Risk is actually adding more loot than the first one does. That's because there's a double or triple dipping depending upon how much you value rarity. There is a single dip in that you've got a pack size boost. There is a double dip in that you've got quantity per monster killed. And then there's that tertiary boost when you consider that the rarity might also be something you value as well. On top of this, it just gets better when you consider tier 17 zone mods, which can be found either on originator influence maps, or they can be found on your tier 17 maps proper. So basically what we've got here is Cartography Scarabs of Risk. They stack well with each other. They provide more loot than pretty much anything else other than some of the rarest scarabs like Horn Scarab or Bloodlines. They're incredibly strong, and they're not that rare, which is the reason that they are so good. On top of this, we have Abyss Scarabs. The other huge factor this league has been Abyss Scarab of Edifice. This generates an absurd amount of loot from chests, and this is clunky to run, but it is very, very lucrative. Now, this was something that was viable in the past, but it's much better this league. There are 2 reasons for this. The first one is that Cartography Scarab of Risk is now better, and there is space in a lot of the Abyss setups in order to use Cartography Scarab of Risk. So this means that this strategy is even better. But on top of that, and actually more important than that, is the fact that tier 16.5 and tier 17 maps, they just simply have tremendous boost to the amount of scarabs that they drop. It's not just scarabs, you can also do this with currency as well. There's a lot of different things you can generate, but essentially those loot multipliers that are found on 16.5s and 17s, they push this strategy from being very solid to being absolutely extraordinary. Okay, so now we get to the most important starting point for deciding on an atlas. And this is something that we'll see a bit of a breakdown when we go through the different atlas trees people are playing. There is one category of map that is what I would term a fast map. This is where you don't try to scale the amount of loot that you get per monster. You just try and get through your maps as quickly as possible. And you look for events that you can then add on to your maps. Ones where the primary value of it is not the monster drops, it's something else. A good example of this is in-map heist events. Here, you'll add a number of additional smugglers' caches onto your map. You'll tap those, they're very quick to loot, and then you'll just move on. It doesn't matter how juicy the map is. If you're running 100% Delirious tier 17 map, you might get a small amount of additional markers, but it's not going to be anything appreciable. Ultimately, the best way to do this is to run unjuiced maps and run them fast. The second strategy is to scale up the amount of drops that you get for every single map that you run. And here, you want to go with things that provide loot multipliers primarily. One thing some people do is they ignore some really easy ways to just add loot that are so effective that they end up being better than the tiny multipliers you can get in their place. We'll come to that when we talk about some of the map mod effect clusters, and particularly invasive adversaries and why it's so good and why it's so underrated in this league. Ultimately though, you want to choose one of these 2 directions. You either want to go for the fast maps or the juicy maps. Both of these strategies are viable. The more powerful your character is, the more that it's worth your while leaning towards the juicy map strategies. But ultimately, go with whichever one you prefer because they can both be made to work. Additionally, starting characters will do really well at the moment by doing fast mapping strategies. So this is things like Betrayal, this is things like Heist, things where you can just go into a map, do it quickly, get on to the next one. This is a very, very good way to get started if you're having a late start in Trade League. More on late starts later on in the video. Ultimately, when you're putting together an Atlas strategy, you want to ask yourself, will this Atlas clusters affect multiply the loot of the entire strategy, like a more multiplier, or will it just add loot, like an increased multiplier? Focus on stacking one of the two, not both of these at once. But don't go too far in this because there are definitely some times that you do want to mix and match these up. Okay, so let's start with the people who are using something that I would term a starter atlas. This is a very uncommon setup for people who are level 98, but I do think it's something that's more common earlier on in progression, and the number of people who have spec'd into commissioned officer and then respec'd out of it is likely to be something like 50% or more of all of the people who've got very high level characters at the moment. So 4% of high-level players, 1,671 people, have commissioned officer set up on their tree. And this is the marker that I'm using for what I term a starter atlas. This is one of those things that does have a couple of other uses. It's useful in conjunction with Harvest Beast, for instance, but it's at its best when getting started. And this, of course, is a notable that grants a 6% chance for Kirac to grant you a mission after you complete any map. Now, other Kirac mission and scouting report related clusters on the passive tree, they're almost never kept on high level characters. They're just not really worth it. Kirac missions ultimately, even though they got buffed a little bit in 3.26, they've just been buried under waves of power creep to other things that you can do. And every buff to other Atlas options just makes these less and less appealing. So we have things like all of the new Harvest Beasts, we have things like the comprehensive scouting reports. All of these exist, but essentially high level players don't care about them because ignoring them ends up being the best path to success at the moment. Now, I did quickly mention before the prospect of starting late and what sort of atlases I'd advocate there. If you are starting really late and you're just jumping into 3.26 for the first time, I'd like to advocate that you focus heavily on Betrayal. There's a couple of reasons for this. Firstly, if you can defeat Katarina, the Syndicate Mastermind, Veiled Exalted Orbs are currently wanted by almost everyone. Now, because there's been a league that's been almost as generous to the top couple of percent of the player base as Affliction was, what this means is that the people who want Veiled Exalted Orbs and aren't interested in running Betrayal themselves, they have bid the price up extremely, extremely high on Veiled Exalts. So currently, this means that everything related to Betrayal is extremely, extremely lucrative. So Syndicate Medallions were something like 7.5 Divine Orbs at the time I was recording this video. Veiled Exalts were somewhere around 30, and then you're also getting all Flame Members on top of that. So essentially, there is a lot to get out of Betrayal at the moment. Map generation, Kirac missions, Betrayal, and Shrines. This is a good starting place for an Atlas if you're just getting started. And when you've got more points, you can add in Heist as well, and potentially even add in Destructive Play if you want to generate your own Elder Guardian, Shaper Guardian, Synthesis, and Conqueror maps in order to just unlock those hardest individual points on the Atlas. After this, probably the most defining decision that you'll make with your Atlas is which of the 4 options for influence you want to invest in. Now here, it's interesting, Originator Influence is an option, but I'm not really considering it here. Instead, what I'm going with is Eater, Exarch, Maven, or none of the above. This is the options that you've got on the actual map device itself. You can invest into the Originator stuff as well if you want. There's a couple of points on it that are pretty good, especially the ones that increase the chances of a memory tier appearing by 10%, but those are more something I would not associate with any particular influence type. They're more something that I would associate with a fast Atlas. There's also a couple of points near the top of the tree that give you the chance to have Originator influenced maps drop. So this is distinct from the ones that cause memory tears to spawn. And although they can sometimes be useful in the same ways, the reason that you'd want to do these is on atlases that are spec to generate a lot of extra maps to run. And in particular, they're really good alongside Cartography, Scarab of Corruption, or other similar Scarabs that just scale up the amount of maps that you get dropping. Anyways, of these options, Eater of Worlds is 36% of the playbase. 15,963 high-level players are chasing Eater of Worlds influence and taking Eldritch Gaze for this. Now, there's a very small number of people that also take Shadow of Hunger, but not Eldritch Gaze. And I think the explanation here is that those players don't feel strong enough yet. In terms of the other influences, 16% of players, 6,881, are pursuing Exarch influence. Destructive Play is 7%, 3,139. This is probably a bit better earlier on, something people tend to outgrow once they start doing juicier maps. And then there's a lot of people, 41.5%, which is 18,193, that are taking neither of these major influence keystones. Those people are free to still pursue an influence, they're just not investing heavily into it. They're not throwing a whole bunch of extra points into making one of the influences better. Now, when it comes to juiced maps, Eda is numerically the best choice here. There were some changes that were made this league. They did make Exarch a little bit better comparatively than it was, but they didn't go far enough to bring them into parity. So, Eda of Worlds is the superior choice if you're going for very, very juiced maps. However, Exarch is still fine if you're playing a character that just can't handle the Eda influence, and there's a number of mechanics that it can have. For example, you might be playing a character that cannot handle the mechanic projectiles fire in random directions. If that's the case, then Eda of Worlds is probably a worse choice for you than Searing Exarch. Destructive Play and the related but different Starter Atlas concept, these are weaker on juiced maps as well. These are things that are for faster maps. Now, Exarch, though, it's interesting. There are two different ways that you can focus on the Exarch. You can play it as a slightly worse version of Eda, and in order to do this, what you would do is mostly pick the ones that nerf the player. So you'd pick things like player gains, flask charges are nerfed. In exchange for this, you gain some sort of additional chance for items to drop, like maybe you get some quantity in the zone. Or the other option is to focus on the upsides that mostly affect minions. This approach is something that has become a little bit more lucrative in this league, with Grand Exarch Embers becoming more valuable than they usually are. Grand Exarch Embers primarily come from these minion affecting upsides, and so that's one to keep in mind as a choice. So essentially what you do, if you're going with this second approach, you only tap maybe the 20% of altars that are best, and you tap the upside that affects minions when you find it, and then that's something that then doesn't make the map as hard as it would be if you affect the player with all of the altars, but at the same time, it provides you with a decent chunk of extra loot. So there's a couple of different choices there with the Exarch, and it's worth noting that where you're using it like a slightly numerically worse version of Eda of Worlds influence, because you can cope with the downsides, that's best in juice maps, but if you're doing speedier maps, then you want to focus on the other option. And lastly, of course, you can do that speedier option with Eda of Worlds as well, but I would recommend Exarch over it. And next we have the mechanic that is probably the most important of all, Map Modifier Effect. There are three classes for this. They're the most popular ones on the Atlas. They are the biggest loot multipliers on the Atlas as well. And warning, warning, these will brick a lot of builds. Let's take one simple example here. You've got a map that reads 70% chance for monsters to avoid elemental ailments. If you've got 43% map mod effect, what does that become? Well, 70% scales up to 100.1%. This means that monsters become absolutely and utterly immune to all sources of ignite. They're completely immune to all sources of freeze. They're completely immune to all elemental ailments, full stop. This ends up being something that probably makes your character completely unable to function. So you need to keep this in mind if you're investing in Map Modifier Effect. Or you could repeat the mistake that I made in patch 3.25 when I was playing a bleed-based gladiator. What did I do? I went into a map that had 50% bleed avoidance on monsters, 50% physical mitigation on monsters, and also 50% chance for monsters to block attacks. I then scaled all of these up to the point they were something like 87%, and I then fought the Abomination map boss like that. I probably wouldn't recommend doing that, given that it took me something like 20 minutes to do all the damage necessary to kill that Abomination map boss. That said, it was fun, it just wasn't particularly lucrative and wasn't particularly worth the time. Now, builds that take Map Modifier Effect, they should scale it with other loot multipliers on their Atlas, such as Eldritch Altars, additional packs, or mechanics like Abyss or Breach that just add monsters. You can also scale loot through various Scarab nodes, through quantity, and the like. There is a quantity circle and there's a quantity rarity circle close to the center of the Atlas, and those are things that are often taken alongside these map modifier effects, not just to path through them, but to take those nodes deliberately. The one thing you want to probably do though is avoid once per zone effects that don't really add monsters. So this is things like Heist, which doesn't add monsters at all, or Destructive Play, which only adds a couple of unique bosses. Those do not scale well with map modifier effect in general. Now, map modifier effect nodes can gain from any number of spare Scarab slots, 0 through to all 5. And additionally, I want to talk about invasive adversaries. This node is vastly underrated at the moment. This thing is attached to one of the small clusters that provides increased map modifier effect. So there are 3 small nodes that people take that are 3% map modifier effect, and then they lead to this as the notable in that cluster. This one often gets skipped by people who take the small nodes, and I think this is almost always going to be the wrong choice. Now, there are a couple of exceptions here, but almost always you want to take invasive adversaries. The reason you wouldn't take this is if you're doing a strategy like some Blight strategies, where you go into a map, you very quickly find a single event, you perform that event, and then you leave the map. In that case, invasive adversaries is a waste of a point. However, for everyone else, if you're actually clearing out the map in general, or at least coming close to it, what this is doing is it's adding 10% more packs, and those 10% more packs are going to be tier 17 exclusive monsters. Those seem to drop something like double or triple the loot of a normal monster. So it's like a 30% more multiplier to the base loot of the map. This then gets scaled up by all of your map modifier effect that you've got, and as a result, it ends up being absolutely fantastic just for adding base loot in. Ultimately, it adds so much that it ends up being a top-notch node even on strategies that are focused on non-native monsters. So even if most of the things that you're killing in the map are the breach monsters, you'll still find that invasive adversaries is one of the best single points on your entire atlas, even though it doesn't multiply the loot that you're getting from the breach monsters. Highly recommend taking this point as soon as you're strong enough to handle it, and then ultimately, if you need to save a point somewhere, drop off a 2% map modifier effect node or a 3% scarab generation node, because you probably have some of those that you can spare. The next big cluster of nodes that people take are scarab multipliers. Now, I want to start with remarkable relics. 44% of you are taking this, 19,268. This is one of the most commonly taken nodes on the entire atlas. It sounds absolutely fantastic. Less common varieties, sounds like you're going to get more of the super valuable scarabs, and you're going to get fewer of the trash ones. In practice though, it actually seems to be a trash node according to the largest available sample size test. I do want to warn you though, this is based only on a sample of 10,000 scarabs generated with it and 10,000 scarabs generated without it. So it's not something I would say is absolutely proven to be a bad node, but it just doesn't seem very good. So what it looks like 95% of the time, Remarkable Relics does nothing. 5% of the time, it rolls 3 times and it awards the rarest of the 3 scarabs that would be rolled. This is definitely not proven, it's just the best model that's been able to be found so far from the available data. If that's the case, this notable is worse than a 4% scarab node and probably actually worse than a 3% scarab node in general, and I would not recommend taking it. It would be different if this was giving you double or triple a number of the rarest scarabs on the tree, but it feels like it's only giving you 10% more of those, and of those rarest scarabs, some of them are actually coming at the expense of some of the valuable lower tier scarabs, like the baseline Abyss Scarab, like a few others. Ultimately, I'm just not sold on this node. I don't think it's very good. Next, Skittering Swarms is the next thing. This is fantastic. Where I was advising you probably want to skip the last node, this one is something you definitely want to take. 12% increased scarabs found in your mounts, 37% of you are using it, that's 16,139 level 98 pluses. It's fantastic. And there's also Amplified Artifacts, which is the one that gives you more scarabs from rare monsters. Also very solid for most strategies, but do use your brain. There are going to be some strategies where this is not a useful node to take. Then we have a couple of really interesting ones. Explorative Carapaces and Trapping Carapaces, these are ones that bias the scarabs that drop in favor of certain popular types of scarabs. An editing gog here with an obligatory SSF mention. These bias you towards scarabs that are popular in Trade League, but if you're playing in solo self-found, then biasing towards other scarabs is entirely sensible. For example, early on in particular, biasing towards Essence scarabs might be fantastic. And again, this is one of those cases where I'm sure that you've got enough of a brain that you'll be able to use it in order to work out which ones suit you. So Explorative Carapaces is being used by 18%, that's 7,862, and Trapping Carapaces by 34%, which is 14,912. Now fun fact, Explorative Carapaces is actually the strongest of these notables, as in terms of scarab biasing. However, the reason that it's not taken by as many people is that it does take a few extra points to path to. It's currently located at the top of the central quantity wheel, and so if you're taking the quantity wheel, it's easy to pick this up, and it's a fantastic 3 points. The 2 small nodes that lead up to it, they're also good as well, they're scarab multipliers. But if you're not taking that quantity wheel, you're going to need some travel nodes to get to it, and I can understand not picking it up. Trapping Carapaces is less powerful. This is the one that biases towards ambush scarabs. It's a little bit more explosive because the best of the ambush scarabs is a huge drop, but the Cartography Scarab of Risk is something like 20 times as common, and that's the reason that it ends up being so much better to spec Explorative Carapaces. What I think is influencing a lot of people here is overvaluing Remarkable Relics that we were discussing before. So it seems like without Remarkable Relic spec, it's about 20 times as common to get Cartography Scarab of Risk as it is to get the Ambush Scarab of Containment. Not exactly certain that it's 20 times, but it seems like it's about that. Now, if Remarkable Relics was really, really good, then it might crunch that 20 times as rare down to only being 10 times as rare. In that case, you would say, oh, well, I'm going to take Remarkable Relics, and then suddenly I want to go for the moon. I want to go for the Ambush Scarab of Containment, and it's okay if it means that I'm doing that instead of chasing the regular Cartography Scarab of Risk. However, because I don't think Remarkable Relics does anything like crunching it from 20 times down to 10 times, based on the sample size we've got, it's probably more like 18 times instead, well, that means that you end up not really getting much benefit out of Remarkable Relics, and ultimately you're better off going with Explorative Carapaces instead of the Ambush one, or alternately, of course, you can take both, because the Ambush one is still a good node. It's just if you're only taking one of them, it should be the Carto one. So these are the Scarab biasing nodes. They're better than they look, and you should probably consider these if you're playing any sort of spend a lot of time in each map atlas setup. Chittering Campions is the next one, rightly not taken very much. This is the one that gives a 25% chance for map bosses that are slain to give a Scarab. 25% just isn't a lot unless you're using Destructive Play, and even if you are already using Destructive Play, it just goes from mediocre to serviceable. It doesn't go from mediocre to great. So take it if you're playing Destructive Play and you've got the points. Otherwise though, no particular worry about it. It's fine to miss even on a Destructive Play atlas. Scarab Blocking is the next thing we want to talk about. An early test that was done this league provided some evidence that Scarab Blocking nodes simply deleted the affected Scarabs. This turned out not to be correct, so someone then went and repeated that test. They repeated it with a larger sample size. What it turned out was that the person who'd done the first test, they weren't being dishonest or anything, they were just unlucky. They just did the test, performed it properly, but it was within statistical limitations. And when it turned out the larger sample was done, it was actually proven that these Scarab blocks, they do re-roll the Scarabs instead. So you should be taking blocking nodes. You should block mechanics that have low demand Scarabs, and this is based upon the economy that you're playing in. So if you're playing in Solo Self-Found, you might think the Breach Scarabs are the most important Scarabs you can get, and as a result, you're never going to be blocking Breach. But if you're playing in Trade League, it's a pretty easy choice to block Breach for most people. Here's the popularity of each of the different blocks. Now, there are three numbers that are given here. The first one is just the total percentage of level 98 plus characters that are blocking that cluster. The second one is people who are playing a Scarab Atlas, and that means that they've got at least one of the notables. And the third one is for people who have gone in on map modifiers and Scarabs. So that means that they've got mounting modifiers and they've also got the 12% increased Scarab node. And you'll see there that there's more of a consolidation behind which of the things to block. Now, it's interesting to note that Ultimatum Scarabs on average and Harvest Scarabs, they feel like they're the best Scarabs. They are good Scarabs, but they're less extraordinarily good than they seem. Cartography Scarabs are by far the best category, and that's because Cartography Scarab of Risk is relatively common and it's worth so much. Harbingers, Harvest, Ultimatum, Ambush, they're a distant, roughly equal second in terms of the value of the Scarabs that you've got, but you can't block some of those. You can't block Ambush, you can't block Harbingers, so that's basically what we're looking at there. Generally speaking, I think the player base is currently undervaluing blocking nodes and also Scarab biasing nodes like Explorative Carapaces. These nodes are really, really good. They're top tier loot multiplier nodes, and the more blocks that you take, the better each one of them becomes. Contrast this though to the Carapace nodes, where the more of them you take, the weaker each one becomes. Ultimately though, there's only really two that are worth taking at the moment, and then there's one or two that are marginal. You could take them if you're using those Scarabs yourself, but they're not really good. I don't want to advise you though to go as far as blocking Ultimatum or Harvest though, as some people do. Those mechanics have a worse average Scarab value than Cartography Scarabs, but they're equal or better than everything else, and as a result they end up just being better than an average Scarab. I also want to say you probably don't want to block things you run yourself, mostly because time spent interacting with Faustus and time spent trading, that's time spent not playing the game, and so it's good to be able to loot the Scarabs you're using yourself. Now we'll get into mechanics in a sec, but we just want to start by talking about places to spend your last points on your tree. So you've got everything you really want. What do you want to spend the rest of the points on? You've only got 5 Scarab slots, you need to remember this, and you can't usefully consider a second Scarab hungry mechanic if all your Scarab slots are tied up for that atlas. So if you're juicing your maps, what you want to do at this point is spec more Scarab drop nodes and more Scarab biasing. For example, take Explorative Carapaces if you don't already have it, and alternately take the ambush equivalent if you don't already have that. Alternately, you can spec into the central wheel of quantity and rarity. You can spec into the central quantity wheel. There's a number of other little things like that. These nodes remain good even now that we're late in the league and that Scarab prices have fallen a lot. If you're blitzing maps, what I would encourage you to do is consider Heist, Shrines, Einhar, although Einhar will tie up some Scarab slots, Destructive Play, or Searing Exarch Altars with a focus on the minion drop altar mods. All of these mechanics don't scale very much with juice level, and also Harbingers is one more thing that can be okay as well. Now, if you are juicing maps, Shrines and Exarch Altars are also options, although you'll have different altar mod priorities. You'll start taking the ones that affect the player more often, but also so can Eater of Worlds, so can map mod effect, so can Scarab Generation. So you want to keep those things in mind when you're thinking about what to spend the last points on. All right, let's get to the mechanics, and let's start with Heist. 4%, 1,719 players are playing this at the moment. It is a fast mechanic. Now, the things that are near universal here are Casing the Joint, No Honor Among Thieves, and Secret Stash. The Dutiful Soldier is good, and I would say that most people should spec into it, mostly because it just makes you faster in maps. Once Huck is joining you in maps, you can give Huck a piece of equipment, Heist Rogue equipment, that will cause him to project a level 15 Haste Aura. This is something you'll be able to afford pretty quickly if you don't already have it, and this will then affect your character and just provide you an extra movement speed boost. It's not Quicksilver Flask level, but it is something. It's almost an onslaught on your character, so you definitely want to have that if you can. If you're already running Haste, then that's a bit less important. It's worth noting that the Friends in High Places notable is quite bad. It doesn't do very much, and the nodes that lead up to it, there's a first node that's 4% chance for a Smuggler's Cache, that's actually reasonably good, but then there's one that biases jobs towards level 3, 1 to 4, and 1 to 5. These are all pretty bad nodes, and honestly what I advocate, even if your Atlas is entirely focused around Heist, just take the first point. Just take the small point there that's 4% chance for an additional Smuggler's Cache, and completely ignore the level 3 job biasing, completely ignore Friends in High Places. The reason for this is that it will decrease your ability to get contracts that can be completed by Gianna, and contracts that can be completed by Gianna are just better than anything else. If you are going to take one of these nodes though, take the level 3 one. Heists that require a level 4 or 5 job, they will have more loot inside them, but this is not the reason you're running those Heist contracts if you run them at all. What's Heist often paired with? Memory Tear chance is really good in conjunction with Heist because you're doing maps fast. It seems like the Memory Tear base chance might be 5% per map, and you can scale it up a little bit more with more nodes on the tree. And then there's also Kalguuran Ore is often used alongside Heist. We'll get to that a bit when we talk about Kalguuran Ore in a sec. Beasts are another thing that you can spec on the Atlas. 2% of you doing this, 982. Not very many of you. And this one's a tough one because you need to be well versed in trading via Discords, because there's a number of reasons that beasts just have really, really awful interaction with all of the trade mechanisms in the game. The thing here is that beasts feel like they should be stackable, but they're not stackable because they have their own monster modifiers. What this means is that people can list an enormous amount of different beasts and they can't be grouped together. Now, if that person is AFK, or if they're malicious and they're just not interested in trading at all, then you're going to go and trade with them. They're just not going to reply at all. And then you're going to scroll down the list, and the trade API is only going to show 100 of the beasts you're looking for, and they'll all be that same person. So you'll want to go to one of the trade discords that bans people like that from dealing there, and that ends up being something that's an extra barrier to getting involved in dealing in beasts, especially because people who are on those trade discords generally aren't interested in doing small trades, they're only interested in doing big ones. Big barrier of entry into beasts. On top of that, there's also a bunch of player knowledge that's important with them. You need to know which ones are not worth killing at all, which ones you should just delete if you do accidentally kill them, and which ones are valuable. Ultimately, learning these skills takes a while, and this is often paired with Kalguuran Ore, Heist, or Memory Tears. Again, fast mechanics. Here with Beasts, if you're taking one of these setups, all of the time that you spend in the map is probably going to be focused on fighting the beasts, maybe killing the map boss, and everything else is a bonus. Betrayal comes next, and Betrayal is interesting in that it's not really done with any specific other mechanics. It really is all over the place. I would advocate doing it in conjunction with fast mechanics, but a lot of people are doing it with other things. It also has odd interactions with Scarabs, and that is that there's only 2 Scarabs that help at all with Betrayal, and one of them just gives you a 100% chance to have a Betrayal encounter on the map, which you can pretty easily get without spending a Scarab slot. Then there's Betrayal Scarab of Reinforcements, which is useful, but that is it. And so you then end up with 4 Scarab slots that are free, but you don't want things that multiply loot because that doesn't really work with Betrayal. So ultimately, it's kind of a messy one to pair with other things. You got 3 to 5 Scarab slots left over, typically 4, that you can use alongside it. Betrayal is also a quite slow mechanic, which is one that makes it pair less well with many other mechanics that you might otherwise pick. For example, doesn't, in my opinion, pair all that well with Heist, in the sense that Heist doesn't make you any worse as a Betrayal Atlas, but having Betrayal, because the Betrayal fights take time, this makes your Atlas worse than a Heist Atlas would be without Betrayal. So that's going to be a thing that comes up with a lot of the faster mechanics. Ultimately, Betrayal is a good thing at the moment to do, especially if you're starting late, because Veiled Exalted Orbs are something that rich players are willing to pay a lot for, and their demand for them is pretty much insatiable, but it's also one of those mechanics that takes a little bit of time to get set up, and also takes a little bit of learning as well, especially if you want to do it in a min-maxed way. That said, it's pretty good even in a non-min-maxed way this league. Beyond is next, and Beyond is interesting. This is a mechanic that is not seen very favourably by most of the player base most of the time, except for this league when it is. 15% of high-level players, 6,603 individuals, have a Beyond Atlas set up with their level 98 plus character. Now this one's interesting in that it is 2 mechanics in one. Most people run it alongside Endless Tide. This is a keystone that means that Beyond bosses cannot spawn, and when a Beyond boss spawns, the Beyond boss is a fight. They're about as tough as the Shaper Guardians. Once you slay them, they will drop some of the Beyond exclusive currency, and then that's the end of the Beyond event for that map. If you run it with Endless Tide, all of the Beyond that is on the map gets nerfed considerably, but you cannot get any of these Beyond bosses. What this ends up doing is that Beyond becomes a more multiplier to the total number of monsters that are present in the zone. So like Invasive Adversaries, it's a more multiplier to base packs, but it's one that also scales with a number of other events that you can do. So it's something that's really, really strong there. The most popular Beyond strategy at the moment pairs it with Incursion, but you don't need to pair it with Incursion. You can pair it with Breach, you can pair it with Shrines, you can pair it with Strongboxes, and you can do a whole bunch of other things as well. Don't feel like it's something that has to be limited to things that are popular. The only mechanics I would not pair Beyond with are things that add a small number of monsters onto a map. So for instance, I wouldn't do it alongside Einhar's Beast mechanic, I wouldn't do it alongside Heist, which adds no monsters. I would instead be looking to do alongside something like Abyss, which adds a very large number of monsters. It's also worth noting that the Incursion variant of Beyond makes no effort to create desirable temples. It will accidentally do so every now and again, but it doesn't really invest in making those temples any better. It simply invests in Elva as a way to generate a lot of extra monsters on every map that's run. So Beyond can be run without Endless Tide as well. This is just a source of one more boss per zone, and that boss will provide you with a bunch of extra Beyond exclusive currency, which can sometimes be useful, although late in the league it tends not to be that valuable. Beyond Scarab of the Invasion is an interesting one. It's extremely powerful with Endless Tide. It scales very well with mechanics that add more monsters to maps, especially ones that add more rare monsters specifically. Each individual Beyond monster that you kill doesn't drop much loot, but it ends up that there's so many of these monsters that you kill that it's a lot over the course of an entire map. Tainted currency isn't a very strong pull into running Beyond. Now there has been some speculation, and I'm not sure whether this is true or not, but there's some speculation that the Beyond bosses might drop different currency or biased in different ways to what drops from the regular monsters. This is something that kind of needs to be explored, because at the moment I don't really know whether it's the case, but it does feel like there are certain currencies that mostly come from bosses. So more exploration's needed on that. But all that said, the tainted currency, there's just not quite enough demand for anything except the crazy rare divine teardrops, and those crazy rare divine teardrops just aren't worth enough to worry about it. Kalguuran Ore is the next mechanic. 12% of people, 5,081 are playing it, but this is one of those things where it's kind of deceptive just to look at the numbers. There are 2 distinct strategies. They look very similar superficially because they take a bunch of the same nodes. They take yield upon yield, they take fortune's favor either way. But then the first of these strategies is what I term Svalin hunting. Here you take Verisium infusion, and that's because the Black Knight appears to replace a Verisium deposit. It's just a percentage chance. If you would have had a Verisium deposit in your map, there's a percentage chance that this is replaced by a Starfall Crater, and you then go and you fight the Black Knight, and you probably cry because you probably don't get a Svalin from him. But if you do, well, you've just picked up one of the most expensive unique items in the game at the moment. The other way that people tend to use this mechanic is Bismuth juicing. Here, a Bismuth deposit, when you tap it, it makes every magic monster that's left in the zone substantially juicier, and every rare monster that's still alive in the zone somewhat juicier. this ends up being fantastic. It's roughly a 50-50 split between these two different strategies, so it's not really 12% of you that are running Kalguuran Ore strategies, it's 6% that are running Svalin hunting, and 6% that are running a different strategy focused around using the bismuth deposits to juice up maps sometimes. Now, the Svalin hunt approach is something that's commonly taken alongside memory tear hunting, with educated upbringing and remembered kindness to bias towards the most valuable of the 3 incarnation fights, and of course, the increased chance for memory tears to spawn. It appears to be 5% baseline in order to get a memory tear, so you can scale it up a little bit there. Other fast mechanics, of course, this plays well alongside Svalin hunting, so this is things like Heist, again, end up being really good here. And next we come to something else where there is one mechanic that people often think of as being the same thing, but there really are 2 different mechanics that are working together here. This is Delirium. Now, depending upon which of the strategies you want to use, it's either 3 or 7% of the player base that are running Delirium. So there is a strategy that I would call Delirium Juicing. Here, you use the mirror. You generally don't take the Unending Nightmare keystone, which is the one that removes all aspects of time from the mirror. And you use this primarily because when you're fighting while delirious, monsters drop items with additional quantity and additional rarity. 7% of the player base, 2,964 players at high level, are doing this. Or alternately, there is a different approach. This different approach is to scale reward tiles through the use of Compulsive Hoarder. Here, you get an additional bonus to the amount of rewards that you get from every Delirium encounter, or at least there's a percentage chance for these to drop additional loot. Compulsive Hoarder is being used by 3% of the player base, 1,322 players, but they're not necessarily the same ones that are doing the strategies involving the Delirium Mirror, because you can use Compulsive Hoarder on a strategy that focuses upon just inherently delirious maps. So you're either using Delirium Orbs, or you're causing your maps to drop delirious through Delirium Scarab of Delusions, which is a really, really good Scarab for exactly this. So that is the Delirium setup. Notice here that this is not one cohesive thing, and that's because Delirium really does point you down 2 divergent directions. You can go with either of them, or you can do both of them on the same atlas, but it's probably better just to go hard on one of them. Ultimatum comes next. Now, this one's interesting because this is one of the few times that I can say very authoritatively, this is mostly being done by one character archetype. Ultimatum is being done by 2% of high-level players. 763 of you are on an Ultimatum Atlas. Now, of those, 41% of the players are playing as chieftains. And it's worth noting that some people might have like a level 95 chieftain that's running their ultimatums, and then have a level 99 character that's running a different atlas, and they've just logged out with their Ultimatum Atlas going, but they've come up as a level 99 of something else instead of being their level 95 chieftain. It's probably actually more than 41% of people here. That's just because the Chieftain Ascendancy is incredibly strong when it comes to the specific challenges that are posed by fighting monsters in a circle, and Ultimatum even more so than other encounters that are somewhat similar, like Ritual. Ultimatum is extremely niche this league, and that's because it just doesn't really scale as high as the loot from other mechanics. Its unique drops, this is inscribed ultimatums, some uniques, and catalysts, they're primarily actually products of Scarab use, not of ultimatum running. So what I mean by this here is that when you're running an ultimatum in a map, the loot that you get from it is scaled up so much by the use of the rarer Scarabs. This is Ultimatum Scarab of Catalyzing. This is also the Ultimatum Scarab of Dueling. These are so good at getting you those rarer rewards that ultimately, the way I tend to think of them is that catalysts aren't a reward for doing ultimatums, they're a reward for looting Ultimatum Scarab of Catalyzing. The Trailmaster uniques, they're not a reward for running ultimatums in maps, they're a reward for getting an Ultimatum Scarab of Dueling from somewhere and then going and using that. Ultimately, I don't think this mechanic is in a great state at the moment. The top Scarabs for Ultimatum are so good that they devalue drops for the entire mechanic, rendering it pretty bad when you're not using one of these Scarabs. In solo self-found, these Scarabs are so rare that it's not quite true that they may as well not exist, but they almost might as well not exist. Now, if you play in Trade League, these Scarabs are pretty cheap except for the Catalyzing one, so the Ultimatum Scarab of Dueling is definitely not very expensive. If you've wanted to fight the Trailmaster, it does make it really accessible to do so. As a result, I think the mechanic doesn't really work that well in either of the 2 game modes. Blight comes next, and I'm going to keep the Chieftain background here because Blight is another thing where proliferating explosions through packs is an extremely solid way of doing them. Now, this is something that's akin to Delirium again. There are two very different approaches that you can use towards running Blight. The first one is focusing upon scaling the pump loot as much as you can. The second one is focusing upon scaling up the loot chests that you get. These require quite different atlases and also tends to require different scarabs, just different choices all the way. So they take quite different trees, but immune response is good in both approaches. This is the one that causes Blight monsters in your maps to spawn 100% faster and also to spawn 50% more non-unique monsters. What this does, it means that you can do more Blights per hour once you're powerful enough to do so. And 4% of you, or 1,563, are playing a Blight tree according to this. But there are different ways that you can then scale a loot. The people who are focusing upon pump loot, what they tend to do is scale map modifier effect all the way to the moon. They take absolutely everything that can scale map modifier effect, and then they can even fill out their rest of their tree with Scarabs of Risk if they want. They don't have to, they can use other strategies, but that tends to be one of the popular ways of doing that. Ritual is next, and Ritual's getting played by a lot of people. 8% of you, 3,746. Now, Betrayal is similar to Ritual in one way. Both of them have jackpot drops that are worth a very large amount. In the case of Ritual, it's the Omen of Fortune. In the case of Betrayal, it's the Veiled Exalted Orb. They also have semi-jackpot drops that are much more common. So for Ritual, that's the Omen of Blanching. And over in Betrayal land, this is the Veiled Chaos Orb, or it's the All-Flame Ember of the Gilded, or it's the All-Flame Ember of the Ethereal. All of these end up being quite valuable, and they're quite a strong pull into running this particular type of content. Now, Omen of Fortune is really, really rare still, but it's not unreasonable to hope to see one. Blanching, on the other hand, Blanching is quite common, and every time you get it, it's a couple of divines. This is paired a lot with Rogue Exiles and with Shrines. This is far from universal though, and the reason that people pair Ritual together with Rogue Exiles is that it can produce extremely, extremely juicy Ritual vessels that can then be used later in a different map. And this is then something that gets run in very specific strategies, but it's focused upon getting as much as possible in the way of loot that drops from the monsters that are slain in the Ritual. That tends to be one of the main strategies that's using Ritual at the moment. So you can generate those ultra juicy ones, or you can consume them. Both of these are viable. Both of them are ways that you can play with Ritual at the moment. Next, we'll jump to Expedition and Legion. Unfortunately, these two have been completely outscaled and completely fallen off as the league's gotten older. So less than 1% playing each of these mechanics. They're actually both really good mechanics, but they're really good at the start of a league. They get outscaled and they award rewards that people want early in the league, but that players cease to chase in the longer term. A couple of good examples here. 6-link chess piece. Legion drops a lot of these from the Geomancer's Incubator. Good stuff rare gloves. ROG is fantastic at making good stuff rare gloves. Again, these get eclipsed later. Now at the start of the league, looting 2 6-links an hour from Legion is absolutely incredible. This is at a point where one Veiled Exalted Orb might only cost as much as 10 6-links, or might only cost as much as 2 6-links if it's really early on. But now, a Veiled Exalted Orb is literally worth hundreds of these 6-links if you can sell the 6-links at all. And Legion emblems, they're just not wanted in large enough numbers to really turn this thing around. Expedition is similar. Expedition, just fantastic at making those rares that are good enough to get started, but ultimately, that's not what players in Trade League are looking for at the moment. That's why these have fallen off so hard. Are they in a bad spot? I don't really think they are. They're really, really good early on, but they just fall off really quickly. Abyss comes next, and we already mentioned this a bit when we discussed the Abyss Scarab of Edifice and its huge impact on the meta. That's why 10% of people are playing Abyss strategies, 4,395. But there's actually a number of ways you can engage with Abyss content. We already discussed the Abyss Scarab of Edifice strategies earlier on, where you go with 2 Abyss Scarabs, 1 Abyss Scarab of Edifice, and then you fill out with risk if you're capable of using them, or alternately you just forego the risk Scarabs and do something else. Then you fill out the rest of your atlas with whatever. You probably want to go with all of the map modifier effect you can, and you run tier 16.5 or tier 17 maps in order to explosively scale the amount of loot that you get, but particularly Scarabs. You tend to have a lot of Scarab generation on a tree like this, and it ends up being one of the best sources of Scarabs that you can get. You can also slightly modify this, especially if your maps happen to roll map generation on them, and then you can use some of the Scarabs that modify maps that drop in order to get a very large number of 8-mod maps, or even 8-mod Delirious maps, or 8-mod maps that might convert into Shaper Guardian maps. There's a number of different things that you can do. Ultimately, that's a flexible strategy, but it's also worth keeping in mind that Abyss can be played in other ways as well. The non-meta Abyss strategies that are worth considering are to use 2 Abyss Scarabs, 2 Abyss Scarabs of the Multitude, and then potentially 1 Abyss Scarab of Profound Depths, and use this in order to focus upon generating loot from the monsters that come out of the Abysses instead. This is a different playstyle. At the moment, it's probably weaker than the Edifice strategy, but it is something to keep in mind, particularly for future leagues, and it's also a very, very safe way of getting XP if you end up turning off all of your map modifier effects, because map modifier effect is something that adds a lot of difficulty for a small amount of XP. It adds a lot of difficulty and a lot of loot, but it only adds a small amount of XP. So if you turn that off, then Abyss can be an extremely safe way to get XP as well. So there's a lot of things that can be done with Abyss. That's why it's so popular, but primarily the Edifice strategy is the one that is meta defining. After this, we have Breach. Breach is an interesting one. 7% of you, 2,891 players are running Breach. Now this is not used for the Breach exclusive loot. It's not being used for things like Breach Stones. Those are just a tiny bonus if they ever drop. Instead, it's used as an alternative source of a lot of monsters. You can do this with Abyss, you can do it with other mechanics, but Breach is the one that's probably most popular at the moment if you're wanting to use map modifier effect scaling and also use Beyond. So you're looking to find ways to multiply the number of monsters on the zone as much as possible. Well, Breach is your starting point. Breach is where those monsters come from, and they then get multiplied by all these other sources. Harvest comes next, and Harvest is in a really interesting spot. So 7% of you, 3,168 playing it. Player demand for Harvest Juice is pretty close to insatiable, and you can't get it through any other mechanic. So this means that despite the massive amount of inflation that's gone on in this league, Harvest is something that is still reasonably lucrative to choose. Now, Harvest seems to scale with 50% of zone quantity. So Risk Scarabs here, they function, but they're not fantastic. So you're playing a build that can't really function with Risk Scarabs. For instance, you're doing all physical damage and you don't have investment into making yourself physical reflect immune, then in that case, you'll find that Harvest is an option, because those Risk Scarabs, whilst they can work with it, they're definitely not required at all. Harvest very much requires its best Scarabs, and it has some fantastic ones. Harvest has Harvest Scarab of the Cornucopia, which doesn't work with every strategy, but is incredibly good. But it's Harvest Scarab of Doubling that is the really, really, really strong one. The other sort of thing I wanted to raise here is a quick look at the overall Atlas Tree heat map. This is a heat map. The redder that something is, so the warmer the color is, the more people are speccing this. So you can see here that the inner quantity wheel is being taken by a lot of people, something like 50% of people if it's green. The teal of the inner quantity and rarity wheel is something like 25% or so. And then it's darker blue, where there are fewer people taking things. Essences were great early, but they're now down to just 3% of the player base. The Shrine package is pretty much everywhere. 30% of people are doing it. It's fast, it doesn't require Scarabs, and it allows you to borrow power from the Atlas. So what this will allow you to do, it'll allow you to mostly do things you already could do, but do them faster. But it will also sometimes allow you to beat bosses that you might not otherwise have been able to beat at all. And then we have those central circles that are really good. Unfortunately, I can't get exact numbers on how popular they are, but they are definitely being used a lot. Anyways, that is an overview of what people are doing in terms of endgame atlases. I'm going to leave it there. May your Varlorbs have interesting results.